us. So this panel is the last panel of our conference, but it is actually really very important. It's entitled Future of Coptic Advocacy, Intergenerational Perspectives. This will be the one thing I'll read. An intergenerational approach is one that builds on existing relationships between different generations. It enables the strengths of two or more generations to complement each other, to the benefit of both or all the generations concerned. I think all of you would agree that our future relies on putting together a plan using the wisdom, the experiences, the knowledge, and the techniques learned throughout the different generations. We need to blend those techniques together to come up with a future advocacy plan. And I think it's critical to our growth. For example, today we heard Congressman Wolf, who gave us some amazing ideas about the religious freedom envoy, selecting an ambassador from our community to represent us in Egypt at the US Embassy. We heard Dr. Fenton talking to us about changing the master narrative and disrupting the narrative, maybe through education. Today we have a great selection of people for our panel. I'd like to start actually with Matthew. Matthew Gindi is a student at the University of California, 20 years old, poli-sci major. He's originally from LA and has been a fervent servant at St. Mark's Coptic Orthodox Church. He's also a servant as a hymns teacher and regularly conducts the choir of deacons during the church services. I am so happy to welcome Matthew because he's going to give us that perspective that we actually haven't heard during the entire conference, and that is the perspective of a young person. I'm really eager to hear about the suggestions, those ideas that would bring that next generation to our cause and that would give it that injection and that enthusiasm and those ideas that, the older generation just may never have thought of. So I will now pass the mic to Matthew Gindi. Come on up.
First off, I'd like to say thank you to Coptic Solidarity and specifically to Lindsay Griffin for inviting me to this conference and giving me the opportunity to discuss what we can do to get the ball rolling about Coptic persecution among the youth of our Coptic communities. Coptic youth born in the US are deeply fervent about persecution but have fallen victim to a sort of bystander effect. A cultural belief that nothing can be done to curtail this archaic issue has been the plight of our subjugated minority in Egypt. In seeking to animate Coptic youth, I believe that the awareness of groups like Coptic Solidarity can reduce this cultural belief and instill hope within Coptic communities. It's essential to raise awareness about this movement within Coptic communities before expanding to the broader American public. One strategy may be collaborating with our southern diocese through Maharaganic Karaza or spiritual competition. Spiritual competition is a summer program, for those of you that don't know, which promotes the study of Coptic dogma, rites, and history, which includes, of course, Coptic persecution, because we are the Church of the Martyrs, so that's a big part of our history. The program is concluded with a test in which youth from all over the diocese gather to spend the day with each other and demonstrate the subjects they've learned over the summer. A Coptic Solidarity canopy or booth, for example, at this event would expose youth to a concept unheard to them, a group stationed in America that aims to curtail Coptic persecution through legislation and policy. I think it's well known that the study of politics is not a common focus within the Coptic community. The idea of a booth or canopy would not only increase awareness and support for Coptic Solidarity within our Coptic communities, but also create an interest in political studies and topics among Coptic students, which in turn would expand this movement's capacity to successfully influence legislation relating to Coptic persecution. It would introduce them to the idea that Coptic sentiments exist in America's political landscape. Another idea could be expanding our social media outlets. Facebook now, oddly enough, is becoming a thing of the past for younger generations. However, Twitter and Instagram have become the main platforms that younger generations interact with the most. One example is a comical Instagram page called Coptic Memes. It has 12,000 followers from all around the globe, and it exposes and includes content relating to Coptic topics, even though they do have a comical nature. But 12,000 followers, those are 12,000 people from all around the globe who are interacting with each other and relating over topics that relate to Coptic people and communities in general. So I believe that if we use these platforms, they could be extremely advantageous in that they would broaden the topic, not only in our community here in the States, but all over the globe. In conclusion, I believe that mobilizing our youth is ultimately one of the most pragmatic approaches Coptic Solidarity can take to developing an effective solution to this issue, not only on our communal agenda, but more importantly on the international agenda. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Next, we have Sami Girgis. Sami Girgis is a PhD candidate in the International Conflict Management at Kennesaw State University. Prior to coming to KSU, Sami was a senior programs coordinator at the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. He holds a master's in international peace and conflict resolution from the American University School of International Service in Washington, D.C., where he was a Fulbright scholar. Welcome, Sami.
Thanks. So thanks so much for inviting me to join you today. It is really an honor to be among you. And before I start talking about advocacy, let us start first with knowing what we are talking about. So if we are speaking about advocacy, we mainly mean that we don't mean that a kind of serving or helping the persecuted people by donating any money or any service to them. But it is different. Advocacy means that it is active promotional or promotional activities that you can do to achieve certain goals, and mainly it involves a kind of relationship with people who are in the power, who are able to correct certain harm or prevent harm from happening. If we apply this definition to our principle or our cause as a Coptic people and for Coptic persecution, we really need to know that do we have active promotion for our cause or not? Do we have certain goals that we are trying to achieve or not? Do we have access to people who are in the power, who are able to make change or not? So we always need to start thinking about all these items in order to have a really active advocacy. So in order to speak from generation perspective, I don't think that there's mainly difference between generation. Only the mechanisms and the techniques are different, but all the generations pass through the same kind of persecution, and it is systematic and widespread persecution and discrimination that all Copts have been suffering from. It is like a chronic disease, so it is not one generation will be different than the other, but I think only the technique and the strategies will be different from generation to generation. And the main factor that might affect the future for the advocacy will be our ability to create a dialogue among the Coptic Christians themselves. We don't have a real dialogue among ourselves, and we're missing this kind of unity among the Coptic Christians. The community that in UK is different than the community that in US and the community in Canada, and the real dialogue is not there. And this is affect actually looking at what our means and our goals and our techniques to achieve this kind of advocacy. The second thing that we're talking about, having people who have skills and techniques and knowledge about the cause itself, especially among the young generation, and working on creating this young generation who have the ability to perform advocacy missions. Third thing that is how to take the principle and the cause of the Coptic persecution from only related to the Copts themselves as they represent to a larger cause that as a representative group for the persecution happening all over the world. It is easy for any politician to dismiss and disregard what we are telling them about the Copts, mainly because this is a small community. However, we speak that this is the biggest religious minority in Middle East and all this, but if it is not really representative for different cases and national security and all this, they will not care. Believe me, like if you go and talk with any congressman and their staff about a certain case for religious persecution, they hear a lot of similar cases. So you have to really tie it to something else, which is mainly how you are represented for different cases, how it is important for national security, and so on. The last thing that I think we should also try to mobilize different groups to join us to defend also the cause that we are our goals. I was so happy to see Bahidin Hassan and different human rights organizations to join us, and I think we need more work with human rights organizations, and we might also think about revisiting the relationship with the church. The church, I know that is maybe out of shape when it comes to advocacy, but it's still an organization with a lot of resources, with a lot of sharing the same goals that we are trying to achieve. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sami. And next I'll introduce Mr. Nabil Mikhail. He is a faculty member at George Washington University. Welcome, Nabil.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. And I distributed copies of the speech, and I'll try to stick to the 3 pages. There is just 1 paragraph in the 4th page. Excuse me for the typo errors or grammatical errors because I did it quickly, and I may be trying to read speedily. And if you did not get a copy, Professor Dr. Mark Aid has copies. He's seated at the end, so talk to him. So let us just read together, and then we can talk. The future of Coptic advocacy, intergenerational perspectives. What is the thesis that can encapsulate future of Coptic advocacy from intergenerational perspectives? The dictionary defines advocacy as public support or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. Intergenerational perspective is very subjective, since each one can define generations differently, and this also could be recollection of personal memoirs. There is an urge to categorize the intergenerational undertaking. Advocacy happened on more than one level, historically speaking. The Copts always registered their views, whether complaints or aspirations, with their governments or the ruling authorities, whatever the system of government was, Republican, royal. And second, they tried to enlist the support of local sympathizers. In modern terms, this means civil society organizations. Lastly, they try to reach the outside world, and this is incongruent with the Lebanese-American professor Elia Harik thesis from Indiana University when he wrote that minorities in the Middle East benefited by the ability to, through communications, to approach the foreign world, whether the public opinion or governments. My point of departure to chronicle quote-unquote Coptic advocacy will be the following eras. There is the liberal age critique provided by a number of liberal writers such as Muhammad al-Tab'i, who advocated back in the 50s the airing of the Coptic Mass every Sunday on radio, and was dismayed by the burning of a church in Suez in January 1952. Incidentally, his support for broadcasting the Coptic Mass was opposed by the editorial board of magazine Madaris al-Ahad or Sunday School, and you know who was the chief editor, Nazir Gaid Rufail, seeing in such an act a degrading of the holiness of the Coptic liturgy. The second epoch should be called the mobilization stage in Egypt history, and it lasted from July 23, 52 till the death of Nasser on September 28, 1970. Here, Coptic-related issues were very much subsumed within the context of a society experiencing a process of being forcibly reorganized by the state toward certain goals, a state of mobilization you can describe. And it was almost frequent to read that Pope Kyrillos VI and Bishop Gregorius received the foreign ambassador at the old cathedral in Azbekiyah, which is an advocacy policy, in my opinion, because it let the senior clergy make an expose about Coptic life and Coptic concerns to a very elite scores of foreign diplomats stationed in Cairo. It was also the embryonic beginning of a number of expatriate Copts who worried about how the conduct of Arab nationalism could be harmful to Copts as a minority. The third stage or period was during the presidency of Sadat from October 16, 1970 till his assassination on October 6, 81, and I label it the reorientations of Egyptian life. Its highlights were the visibility of the persona of Pope Shenouda III and the parallel move to institutionalize the Coptic political activity in the diaspora. The latter's task was to promote a sense of urgency that there is sufficient evidence for religious extremism penetrating Egypt. The fourth phase in Coptic activism was from Mubarak's early days till September 11, 21. I call it the shifting of domestic, regional, and global policies, and it witnessed the mushrooming of many Coptic courses of action. Coptic activism became highly decentralized. A prospect was not liked by both the Coptic Church and the Egyptian government, since both prefer to deal with a recognized unit of opposition than many sources of opposing views. We are now on page 2. These activities try to communicate a minimalist vision, not to be silent if discrimination happened, and a maximalist message that the country was not going in the right direction. As a result, you hear replies from people like Ahram's chief editor Ibrahim Nafi', who urged the Egyptian government and told that they can retaliate against the families of Copts abroad attacking the Egyptian political regime. The fifth juncture was from September 11 till the removal of Mubarak in February 2011. I designate it as the time of rising expectations. The hope was that the West could change Egypt and the rest of the Arab and Islamic countries, and the communications revolution aided the process of having more than one tribune expressing concerns among both Muslims and Christians that there was a need for change in Egypt. Here lies, in my opinion, the difference between Egypt and Iran. In Iran, just a few months before the fall of the Shah in February 1979, no one expected that there could be a change in the political life of that nation. Contrary, everyone in Egypt was expecting a change, either with whether Gamal Mubarak would become president or a process of protest that could place and render some changes in the politics of Egypt. In this regard, Coptic political activism or advocacy put more emphasis on the necessity for democracy. And it was a subtle observation that the official media, this is actually a subtle observation that the media in Egypt has failed to comprehend so far. The Arab Spring is not a conspiracy. It happened and will happen sometimes in the future because societies change, because the system of government change in correspondence to societal changes. The current chapter is to be referred as the redefining of priorities, and it's a process, again, where there is a fierce debate now whether what happened on June 30th, 2013 was enough or more change is needed. Initially, I thought about linking Coptic advocacy with what was said in the conference, like worldwide persecution, personal testimonies, radicalization of society. But since there is a question about the future, I was able to locate a number of statements attributable to the French President Emmanuel Macron. I think and propose that they prove strong and valid premises about Coptic advocacy in the future. While meeting Pope Tawadros II on January 29th of this year at the papal residency in Cairo, he referenced three things. He hailed the sacrifices of the Orthodox Christians. He acknowledged the precarious future of Christians in the Middle East and alluded to the big ethical or spiritual crisis of the West. Here in these statements, there is the further recognition of a novel doctrine in the Christian church, Orthodoxy is not a novel doctrine in Christianity. But what makes these statements a novel doctrine is the role the Orthodox churches and the Christian churches in the Arab world will be performing, ensuring an assured and confident church life together, experiencing their Christian faith joyfully. Macron established a nexus between Orthodoxy and Christians of the Middle East, and he tied it to a spiritual crisis in the West. If there is a skepticism about religious faith in Europe, I always adhere to what St. Thomas Aquinas said, or dictum, doubt is an element of faith. A Maronite who is a Catholic will feel closeness to the Orthodox Church of Antioch as much he or she will feel closeness to the Church of Rome. With Russia's strong presence in Syria, one wonder, will the schism of 1724, where the Church of Antioch split into the Melkite Catholics and Orthodox, be reconciled, considering that the 30th anniversary is approaching? The Copts and the world will be noticing the connection between the Middle East Christians and the Orthodox branch of Christianity. The last page, page 3. The future of Coptic Church is not an expression of helplessness, but the heralding of a prospect of revival, curiosity, respect, and appeal. I recommend and perceive an alignment among the Copts and Muslims with favorable trends in Egypt and world politics. And this, of course, it will be a worldwide phenomenon. They have to capture the moment. The world will not convert to Orthodoxy, but Orthodox Christianity will have an impact on the Middle East even while their numbers or population is declining in their countries. How the church doctrines are supposed to be taught? In the statement by Macron, I would assume that there will be a high degree of closeness and a better process of coordination between the churches in the Middle East among themselves and between them and the Orthodox churches. There will be many epochs of witnessing historical developments, not just in ecumenism, but will transcend persecutions and to be a motive for a search of a moral society and a just government. Without entering into a controversial argument on the subject of a growing closeness between Christians in the Arab world and the Orthodox churches, it is important to give an outline of that type of reasoning. The French president was appealing to a truth. His arguments explain and predict many things. There is an idea of honor in his speech. It highlights a complex condition. It is a vision of the past, present, and the future. It is always also an expression of confidence. It is also the practice of the Christian dogma to have the testimony of someone senior enough to stimulate the submission of a good teaching. He is acknowledging a world of difference pertinent to further study of religion, politics, and society. The title of the panel mentioned the word perspectives. Perspectives can sharpen convictions. Recalling the book which I read as a student, The Soviet Bloc, Unity and Conflict by Zbigniew Brzezinski, he charted the actions of how many or how more than one center of power introduced different types of political interactions in the world of communism among a group of countries, whether they're in Moscow, Beijing, Warsaw, Bucharest, Belgrade, or Albania. By the same token, a restored degree of vitality and dynamism to the lives of Middle Eastern and Orthodox churches would be arrayed to be an incentive and to boost their historical strengths, whether they are found in Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, Moscow, Kiev, Athens, Cyprus, Damascus, Beirut, Baghdad, Amman, or South Sudan. Therefore, the future of Coptic advocacy will be an enlarged vision and a broader effort extended beyond their varied communities into helping the restoration of strong Christian communities in Palestine, Israel, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and others. The Copts succeeded as a community. Look how successful and how thriving their churches in the diaspora are or have become. They can convey their communal experience, quote unquote, to many Christian communities in the Middle East. The Economist magazine of January 5, 2009, this year, had an article called Out with the World. It mentioned that the Brazilian Foreign Minister Ernesto Ariola has called for a Christian alliance embodying his nation along with Russia and the US. However, Christians in the Middle East will not be delivered by a theory invented to account for an opinion with no apparent support in the transactions among the nations and the countries of the contemporary world. The continued life of the church is always to be associated with biblical verses. Orthodox traditions are ones of the historical roots of Christianity. Among many Christians, there is nostalgia to a spiritual position of their faith. In Leviticus 25, verse 41, it says, "Then shall he go out from thee, he and his children with him, and shall return unto his own family, and unto the position of his faith shall he return." In Deuteronomy 4, verse 6, in bestowing an honor on Reuben, the oldest son of Jacob and Leah, "Let Reuben live, and not die. Let me, and nor let his men be few." Let me just paraphrases. Let the Copts, the Maronites, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Syriacs, the Jacobites, the Greek Orthodox, the Melkites, the Anglicans, the Protestants, the Evangelicans, the Armenians, and the Catholics not die, and not let their people be few. Thank you.